So our second speaker is James Danckert. James is a professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and the title of his talk is Boredom as Information Processing, Revisiting Orin Klapp, 1986. James, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, John. Can everybody see the show and hear me?
Yes, I can see you fine. Your volume is a little low to me, but I can hear you okay.
Okay, I'll try and turn the volume up if I can. Otherwise, I'll just talk loud. Yeah. Don't see where I can turn the volume up. Hopefully everybody can hear me, but I'll try and talk as clearly as I can. And I think I should be able to help us catch up on time. A lot of what I'm going to say today has been already laid out very nicely in Erin Westgate's excellent sort of talk. You're going to hear in this session from two of my graduate students, Barbara Dadzi and Chantal Trudel, about some recent work coming out of our lab that I think is really interesting and exciting. But I wanted to use this opportunity to look at some old ideas that I think fit very nicely within the context that Erin gave us in her talk earlier on. So as my title suggests, I want to revisit Orin Klapp's ideas. And Orin Klapp was a sociologist from the mid-80s who wrote a book called Overload and Boredom, Essays in the Quality of Life in the Information Society. And you'll note that date, he's writing it in the mid-80s. And I really love this quote that comes from very early on in his book. It is not at all unusual to have the television or radio on while reading a newspaper, eating breakfast, and now and then talking to somebody. We may also carry a watch or pocket pager, whose beeping signals remind us to move along to new stimuli. We may also carry a cassette recorder, ghetto blaster, as we walk down the street, adding noise for everyone else, or wear a Walkman, giving continual entertainment in our own sonic cocoon. Now, anachronisms aside, what he's trying to point out there is that other end of the spectrum that Erin was talking about. We often talk about boredom at that low end of information processing, where the rate of information change is slow, or things are redundant and monotonous. But what Klapp wants us to focus on is that high end of the information processing chain, where there's so much coming at us that it's hard for us to get an intellectual foothold on what we're doing. It's hard for us to extract signal from noise. And at that end of the spectrum, we might also get bored. Now, I'm going to skip this slide to make sure that we can sort of get through in time. When I think about that high end of the rate of information change, I often think about the North American news television's format. It's not something that I was used to experiencing when I grew up in Australia. But if you look at this, where the hell am I supposed to direct my attention? I've got a talking head in the main part of the screen, either giving me a news story or, as in this case, telling me about the weather. On the top right, I've got another town's weather that I need to focus on. At the bottom left, I've got some sort of television show that's being advertised. Under the weather from the second country or second city, I'm looking at a TV camera for traffic conditions. Beside that, there's yet another television show that's being advertised. And beneath all of that, there's a ticker tape with a news story that will change every 3 to 5 seconds that I'm supposed to pay attention to. It's a barrage of information. And so, as I think John has used this phrase before, it becomes a little like trying to drink water from a fire hose. And this is really that high end of rate of information change. And I think it's something beyond attention and beyond meaning that is important. And hopefully I can convince you of that as we go along, that might also lead to us feeling like we're bored. You've seen this slide already from Erin's talk, and this is sort of some of the early evidence that Orin Klapp's ideas might be right. So she's presented to you this data from an air traffic control task, where when the task was made to be absolutely too easy or too hard, that boredom ratings were highest. There was some sort of just right zone in terms of task difficulty. Now, I suggest this is indirect support of Klapp's ideas because we're not really manipulating the rate of information change. Instead, we're just we're manipulating how easy or hard the person thinks the thing is. We also looked at this in a similar way when we had people play a children's game against a computer opponent. They played rock, paper, scissors. The scissors beats paper by cutting it, rock beats scissors by crushing it, and somehow paper magically beats rock by wrapping it up. But we had two groups of people play against a computer opponent, one in which the group on every single trial, you would lose your game against the opponent. And another group that on every single trial, they would win their game against the opponent. So we sort of rigged the game to either be 100% losses or 100% wins. We didn't tell people about this beforehand. And then we asked them about how much control they felt over the outcome of the task. How much control did they feel they were able to exert in playing this children's game? And like the data that you just saw from Erin Westgate's lab, you can see that we see this curvilinear relationship. When people felt that they had very little control or they had a lot of control over the task, they rated the experience to be more boring. So it seems like, again, this is indirect evidence. It's not measuring a sort of rate of information change that Orin Klapp might have been really interested in. There's either 100% losses or 100% wins. Things are not really changing much in either condition. But that sense of control that people have suggests that they don't feel that when they don't feel they have control, or they do feel that they're fully in control, that they experience higher levels of boredom. It wasn't just about winning all the time or losing all the time. In another condition, we told people that their computer opponent's strategy was exploitable. That is, that if they could figure out the strategy of the computer, they could beat it more often. And this was actually a lie. What we did is we had the computer opponent play a uniform random strategy. So it chose rock, paper, and scissors 33% of the time. And even in this condition, people who reported experiencing low or high levels of control also reported the highest levels of boredom. So again, whether it's task difficulty, the sense of which you're in control of the outcomes of the task, there seems to be this optimal zone for engagement. And that's what this really makes me think about in the context of Orin Klapp's ideas, that there is potentially a Goldilocks zone for how we engage with the world, that we want things to be just right. And again, that this might not necessarily be only in the context of just right for our attentional resources, just right for some level of how we rate things to be meaningful or valuable, but there might be a whole raft of other components to this that really drive our boredom. And I'll talk about some of those a little bit later on. In what I think is perhaps the only really sort of close direct test of Orin Klapp's ideas, Jana and colleagues used what is a fairly simple sort of number guessing game to look at information processing and boredom. So on the top left in that panel A there, people were asked to guess a number between 0 and 100, and that number 76 in the blue vertical column is the participant's guess. After they'd made their guess, the actual number from 0 to 100 would be revealed in the red box so that the participant could see how close or far off they were. And the blue bar on the bottom represents their boredom ratings. And they had 3 different conditions in this task. One in which the number to be guessed was drawn from a Gaussian, so you could learn that mean and variance in that Gaussian distribution, and you could make your guesses better over time. The second condition was a random condition, kind of like playing rock, paper, scissors against a random opponent. There's really nothing you can do to make your performance better on this task. The number's just drawn randomly from 0 to 100. And their final condition that they called a certain condition was not really a guessing game at all. In that condition, the number to be guessed was presented first in the red box, and then people just simply had to type it in. And what you can see is that the boredom ratings in the early versus late trials in each of those conditions showed that in each condition, people got bored over time, but the most boredom was reported in that certain condition. And you can see that again also in panel C, where over time in all 3 conditions, I mean, this is a dirty little secret of psychological experimentation. Our tasks tend to be pretty boring, but over time, people's boredom got higher, but it was lowest in that Gaussian condition where you were at least able to exercise some agency and learn something about the task. The final panel there represents a change in prediction error. That's what PE stands for. And here the idea is that if you have a large change in prediction error, that will be indicative of learning the Gaussian distribution. A small change is indicative of failing to learn the Gaussian distribution. And what you can see is that for those people who had a small change in prediction error, that is that they failed to learn the Gaussian, that they also had higher ratings of boredom. Now, in all of those things that I've just shown you, it's not really about information change or the rate of information change, which I think is the kind of notion that Orin Klapp is really getting at. When there's a low rate of information change, we'll be bored. When there's a high rate of information change, we'll also be bored. There are likely other things sort of going on here, one of which that I've mentioned briefly is the notion of agency. How much control do I feel I have over the outcome of what I'm doing? And I think there's some important background information. You'll hear from my student Barbara soon in this forum about our work looking at agency and boredom, but I think there's some important background information here, much of which you've already heard from Erin. So in the study that's now famous from 2014, where people are in a room on their own with only their thoughts for 15 minutes, if they're given an option of self-administering electric shock, many of them do it. One guy, Erin failed to mention this oddity, but one guy in that study shocked himself 196 times in 15 minutes. Now, that has to go well beyond curiosity. I would suggest that it's got very little to do with attention or meaning. And I might even suggest that by shock 100, he might have been bored by the shocks themselves. But it may have something to do with the compulsion to act, that when we're in a situation where we're doing nothing, we are compelled to act and do something. And I think from what we just heard from some of the behaviours in the pandemic, that some of our responses to being bored are getting out there and doing something different, even when that something might well be self-injurious. We sort of did another thing to follow up on that study where we had people placed in a room with nothing but their thoughts, but there were two conditions here. One, sort of shown on the left here, had people in a room with nothing but their thoughts for 15 minutes and nothing else was in the room. The second group were placed in a room for 15 minutes, and in that room were what we called affordances for action. There was a half-finished Lego puzzle that I stole from my son at the time. There was an open browser that you could have surfed on. There were pencils and crayons and drawing materials and so on. What we told people in that condition is you can look, but you can't touch. And the idea here was that with these affordances for action, that room would feel more boring because there were things that you could act upon, things that you could engage with, but that you were prevented from doing so. And that's indeed what we found, that people in the room where there were affordances for action that they could look at but not touch rated the experience to be more boring. And again, this sort of speaks to this compulsion to act, that boredom is a signal that drives us to act, and that in general, doing nothing is less comfortable than acting in the world and engaging with the world. And just as an aside, because I think this is great, and I think tomorrow we have a speaker from New Zealand who's going to talk about boredom in animals. There's a paper that I recently reviewed for Nature that initially the title of the paper had boredom in it until one of the reviewers, not me, asked that to be removed from the paper altogether because it was considered to be too anthropomorphic. But essentially this paper replicated the Wilson study with mice. So they placed mice either in an empty room with nothing to do or in a room that was enriched that had toys for the mouse to play with. And in both instances, there was a hole that the mouse could poke their nose through. And if they did so, they would get a puff of air. And this is aversive to the mice. They don't like it. What they found is that the mice in the empty room tended to poke their nose through the hole to get that aversive puff of air more so than the mice that were in the enriched room. The graphic on the bottom there represents another condition where they had two holes that the mouse could poke their nose through, one without an air puff and one with an air puff. And even in that circumstance, the mice in the empty room tended to choose the air puff more frequently. It got to a point, in fact, where some of the mice were deemed to be addicted to the air puff. So I think this is interesting in the sense that it suggests this notion that I'm talking about of this compulsion to act, this desire to act, to engage with things in our environment is not unique to humans, and that boredom might just be the signal that we need to find some outlet for that desire to act. And I would suggest that some of the work that we and others found in the pandemic also fits within that kind of notion. So Erin presented work suggesting that single item of boredom didn't really correlate with behaviours in the pandemic. But when you measure trait dispositions to feeling bored, so boredom proneness, we and others have found that it does, in fact. So people who are highly boredom prone and low in self-control tended to break the rules of social distancing more. And I would suggest they weren't doing that out of any kind of malice or any kind of lack of care for their fellow human, but really because that compulsion to act is very strong for the highly boredom prone. And so they really couldn't control that impulse to act as effectively as people who are not prone to boredom. Interestingly too, I think Erin briefly mentioned that hand washing had nothing to do with those behaviours in her multi-country study, and we found that to be true too. There's something odd about hand washing that's not related to any of these measures of boredom and its influence on how we deal with social distancing in the midst of a pandemic. To bring it back to Orin Klapp's ideas, and again I'm going to sort of skip through here so that we can save a little bit of time. There are computational models of boredom that I think are relevant here too. The one I'm going to skip here is on the left from Gomez, Ramirez and Costa. It's a great little model that suggests that boredom is a signal to get us out of the dark room problem. I'm happy to talk about that if we have time in questions, but to me, this is that low end of the rate of information change. So when not much is happening and not much is changing, then we might use boredom as a signal to explore other activities to engage in. The one on the right from you and colleagues talks more about that high end of rate of information change. So what they did is they had two computational agents try to perform various types of maze learning type tasks. And the two agents were either driven by curiosity or by boredom. And they found in their computational accounts that the boredom agent learned the mazes better than did the curiosity-driven agent. Now, they're not suggesting, and neither would I, that curiosity is not a great drive for engagement or a great drive for learning. They're just suggesting that in this particular instance, boredom was a better agent in learning these complex systems. And I think there's a reason why that might have happened. From another study from Berta and colleagues, they had a curiosity-driven agent in their computational accounts, again learning a maze, but in one of their conditions shown on the right here, they put an LCD screen, a virtual LCD screen, on one wall of the maze. And on that screen, they had constantly changing images. Every 2 to 3 seconds, something on that screen changed. And the curiosity-based agent would find that screen and get stuck there forever. Every 2 seconds, there's something interesting to be curious about, something to pay attention to, and no reason to move on. But a boredom-driven agent would find that screen, perhaps stay for a little while, but upon realizing that this information is just a barrage of information at that high end of a rate of information change that Orin Klapp talks about, and that it's potentially not very meaningful, that agent would just rapidly move on. So I think there is some computational evidence here to suggest that at that high end of a rate of information change, that the boredom will help signal that we need to move on to something else. There's another computational paper by Agrawal and colleagues from Jonathan Cohen's lab that I think is really interesting. They suggest at the high end of sort of information processing that we might get feelings of increased effort. And I think there's some interesting and challenging things for us to test there about whether or not boredom and effort signal something different at high rates of information change, or whether or not they interact in interesting sort of ways. So I've spoken at a mile a minute here intentionally to try and pull us back on track at time-wise. But hopefully what you've come away with is that there are testable ideas here from these notions that Orin Klapp talked about in the mid-80s, that beyond focusing our attention, beyond assigning value or meaning to a particular activity, we might look at the just simple rate of information change in our environment. And this may then interact in very important and interesting ways with our capacity to attend, our assignment of meaning, and other factors that I think we've ignored for a long time in boredom research, factors that you'll hear about soon, like agency. And so the other idea from Klapp that I think is an important one in this notion of a rapid rate of information change, he brings up this notion of ego screaming, that when there is a high amount of information change, that one thing to do to try and deal with the challenges of that is to shout louder than the noise that you can't make sense of. And that makes a lot of sense in terms of things like internet trolling and so on. So if I bring it back to the 21st century instead of the mid-1980s, and again, it says apologies to Orin Klapp, you might read this quote in a slightly different way. You might say that it is not at all unusual to have the television on with our laptops open, browsing multiple websites, eating breakfast, and now and then talking to somebody. We may also carry a smartphone whose social media notifications and tweets remind us to move along to new stimuli. We may also carry an iPod, giving continual entertainment in our own sonic cocoon. iPods are probably out of date now too, but the idea is that I don't even think that Orin Klapp could have imagined in his wildest dreams the sheer amount of information available to us right now. And that poses important challenges at the high rate of information change that some of Erin's work that she presented earlier addresses, some of the work I've shown just now addresses somewhat tangentially, I think. And I think the challenge for us is to be more direct in looking at how information processing and the rate of information change may lead to boredom or be influenced by how we experience boredom. So I want to acknowledge my collaborators. Many of those names on the left you will all recognize, but more importantly, I want to acknowledge all my students who do all of the hard yards in this work. I'm just the guy that sort of sits at the end and does presentations like this. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, James. We do have some time for a few questions. So if anybody has a question they want to put in the chat, I can read it out, or you can unmute yourself and address James. James, do you want to tell us about the dark room, since you
Sure.
You didn't go over that? Yeah.
Sure. So this comes from the notion of the brain as a predictive coding machine. So the idea is that we have mental models that we use to predict the anticipated outcomes of our action choices, and that we use any errors from those predictions to refine behaviour. And if the brain is actually indeed operating as a prediction error minimization machine, then the best way to minimize your prediction error is to curl up in a ball in the corner of a dark room, where that environment is maximally predictive. And of course, nobody does that, nor does any animal that I know of sort of do that. So instead, we explore our world, and what the Gomez, Ramirez and Costa paper suggests is that boredom operates as a signal to push us out of the dark room.
Right, thank you. So we have a comment here. Thanks for reminding us or helping us rediscover Orin Klapp, Sociology and Psychology at Last Together.
It's a great book. I highly recommend people read it because it's still quite relevant today. It's one of those books that, despite its age, has a lot of relevance for the way we might think about boredom in our current times.
So I'll ask a question then. So earlier we heard a little bit about different causes of boredom. We heard about meaning deficits and difficulties with attention as being perhaps two different pathways to boredom. Do you have any thoughts you want to share about how to marry those ideas with this notion of information processing overload or underload? Would you suggest that overload and underload can both result in lack of meaning? Or would you think about it a bit differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't given it a hell of a lot of thought in terms of whether or not they would both lead to a lack of meaning per se. One of the things I think about, so that I'm not the meaning person. Erin and Wijnand van Tilburg and these sorts, and somewhat Andreas Alpadura, these are the people that engage with the meaning-based accounts. And so they know a lot more about it than I do. But one of the things I think about with the meaning-based accounts is that you can consider or think about situations that are not too attentionally demanding, but are attentionally engaging, that are meaningful and yet can be boring. Right. So the one that I come up with most commonly, and it'll only make sense to people who've been parents of young children, I think, is that when your child first learns the basis of knock-knock jokes, so you teach them a knock-knock joke, they think it's funny, and then they proceed to tell you 4,792 versions of a knock-knock joke, none of which are funny, right? And of course, it's intentionally engaging because it's your child and they're having a laugh, and so that's fun. It's meaningful because it's your child and you want to engage with that action with your child, and it's thoroughly boring. Like, it's just not a thing that I could find engaging in any way. So while I'm not sure whether or not meaning will be the same at under and overload, I am sure that you can be in the midst of a meaningful activity that's attentionally engaging and it's still boring. And so I think there has to be something else. Now, I also wouldn't say that information processing is the only thing. I wanted to present at this conference because, as somebody said earlier, it's great to have something that's dedicated to boredom. And I like the notion of being able to bring Orin Klapp back into people's consciousness. So I'm not suggesting that information processing or the rate of information change is the be-all and end-all in terms of determining our experience of boredom or how we code it. But I do think that there are other things, and we'll hear about agency in a little while, which, as I know your group has worked on as well, and I know from conversations with you that you see as another sort of critical component that we've paid not enough attention to in the boredom research. Someone's asked here about implications in the classroom, Emmanuel. I have no idea. I'm not a practical or applied psychologist. I think the notion might be, and you've heard some responses to some of your questions earlier in the same sort of vein about what do I do with this in the classroom. It is about perhaps tailoring what you deliver in ways that find that Goldilocks zone for each student. And that's a huge challenge in the classroom, as I would imagine.
Okay, thank you, James.